Thank you very much, Madam Chair. To iRESPE, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to try to speak slowly. My presentation will consist of a few background slides, and then I have a video which covers essentially the clinical signs and post-mortem findings in cases of African horse sickness, and then I will have some concluding remarks. The video does not have a soundtrack, so I will read over the soundtrack, but it should be fairly self-explanatory. If we look back at African horse sickness, there's some literature out there to say that, in fact, the fifth plague, part of what happened during the fifth plague was possibly due to African horse sickness. The first documented description of what was most likely African horse sickness was documents from Yemen in the 1300s. In the 1500s, when Portuguese explorers went into East Africa, they took horses with them. They did not last longer than 2 weeks. As far as South Africa is concerned, neither horses nor donkeys were native to South Africa. They were introduced after the Dutch settlers arrived in South Africa in 1652, and the first cases of African horse sickness are described in documents of the Dutch East India Company dating back to 1719 in the Cape Colony. What about the disease itself? It has an incubation period, so from infection by the midge of 7 to 14 days. And then we see in the field different forms of African horse sickness. The peripheral form, or dikkop, and dikkop in Afrikaans means fat head. So it's the one where you see the swollen supraorbital foci, and it is fairly common in field outbreaks of African horse sickness. The other form, the central or pulmonary form, the dinkop, the thin head form, is the more acute form, and quite often you'll simply find a dead horse and it will have the dikkop form. However, when you go in and do a post-mortem examination on these animals, you will almost invariably find signs of both of these forms in most post-mortem cases in horses dying in the field. And I think the form which is described back in the 1920s by Sir Arnold Tyler, horse sickness fever, I think it's amazing if you look back at the descriptions that he did in those days. I think now with more modern diagnostic techniques, we're actually going back and saying, hell, this guy was right. Because actually we're picking up in the field horse sickness fever cases, which are either horses that have been previously vaccinated, or in some cases, unvaccinated horses that get infected with African horse sickness and actually show very mild or no clinical signs at all. So they do happen, you do see them. We had a case or an outbreak in South Africa in 2014 where the case fatality rate was less than 10%. Our case fatality rates are normally in excess of 70%, and the percentage of cases that were subclinical cases was in excess of 60%. So you do see different kinds of displays of the disease depending on the specific strain of virus that infects the horse or horses. Generally, naive population of horses get infected with African horse sickness. You're looking at a mortality rate of between 70 and 95%. Not that you like to compare different diseases, but obviously if you compare the case fatality rate in African horse sickness, it far exceeds that of the recent Ebola outbreaks in Africa. The other interesting thing about African horse sickness, while we have issues in horses, both zebras and African donkeys, if they get infected with African horse sickness, show no clinical signs. But then as humans, we always like to play with nature and create all sorts of other things. I do love the Tobiano Zorse on the bottom left-hand side. Their susceptibility to African horse sickness is somewhere between that of horses and donkeys. Interesting group of animals right in the middle at the bottom is actually some mules in South Africa. Those mules are out of Percheron mares by Spanish donkey jacks, and they stand well over 16 hands high and weigh 700 to 800 kilograms. They work in the Knysna forests in South Africa, pulling out logs. Those would be totally susceptible to African horse sickness because they are not mules from African donkey jacks. Spanish donkeys are obviously totally susceptible. And then obviously we've got the different other things that man has created in parts of Africa. African horse sickness is not contagious, so it's not passed from one horse to another. It has to be transmitted by biting midges of Culicoides species, and we have experts in the audience today who spent a lot of their time working on Culicoides midges. Obviously, in the like South Africa, which is subtropical, we have a seasonal incidence of African horse sickness. Us being in the southern hemisphere, our peak time of the year is March and April of every year for African horse sickness. Other countries in the northern hemisphere, obviously you'd have to add about 6 months to that. Tropical African countries do have African horse sickness almost throughout the year. So obviously the risks depend on time of year and origin of the animals. Our experience has generally been that African horse sickness outbreaks are usually associated with the movement of animals in southern Africa. Obviously, local movement of midges can play a role. We don't have major waterways between parts of our country, but we do have major highways, and we do get animals being moved long distances in a very short time. And our experience has generally been that is associated with movement of animals, whilst obviously movement of midges may play a role. It is not the major problem in our part of the world. There are 9 different types of African horse sickness virus, and each of the different types requires a specific vaccine. If you look at the primary cycle in Africa, it's probably existed in Africa for millennia, and the primary cycle is between the Culicoides midges and zebras and African donkeys. And obviously they've worked out a way to live together and not harm each other. When we introduced horses into Africa, we introduced a secondary cycle, and that's when we started seeing the disease. Where is it endemic? Basically, sub-Saharan Africa. If we look in the southern and eastern parts of Africa, all 9 serotypes of African horse sickness occur in those parts. If we look at the northern parts of Africa, the Sahel of Africa, until very recently, serotype 9 has predominated. More recently, there have been other serotypes identified in those parts of the world. What is the reservoir for African horse sickness in Africa? The African or the zebra definitely does play a role, has been identified to play a role. But if you look across the Sahel of Africa, where there are almost no zebra, the donkey plays a very significant role. So lots of people, and I did have a person suggest a solution for African horse sickness in South Africa was to exterminate all the zebras. I said he'd be welcome to bring all his friends along. We'd organize the hunting parties, but he also needed to bring the CITES permit to exterminate the Cape Mountain zebra, of which there are less than 1,000 in the world. He hasn't come back to me. He happened to be a Frenchman. If we have enough beers in the evening, we may say who it was, but not right now. As far as epizootics outside of Africa are concerned, regularly reported through Egypt, the Middle East, in the 1950s, and probably the most famous one was the outbreak that started in southeastern Iran in 1959, spread in 1960 to 61, and basically went as far as Bombay in India and as far as Turkey in Europe, on the borders of Europe. I'll leave it at that. And in that outbreak, in excess of 300,000 equids died. One of the major issues with that outbreak was that most of those animals were working animals, and at that time, the people relied on them for their livelihood. So it caused major economic disturbances to those people. Obviously, following that outbreak, the World Organization for Animal Health, OIE, where we happen to be enjoying their hospitality today, introduced the first code for African horse sickness in 1964. Further outbreaks in North Africa, 1965, and did cross into Spain in 1966. The most famous outbreak, or the most notorious outbreak in Europe, was the 87 to 90 outbreak associated with the import of zebra from Namibia that left Namibia on the 2nd of June of 1987, actually arrived in Lisbon on the 16th of June of 1987, and were transported from there to a safari park just south of Madrid, arriving on the 18th of June of 1987. I think the really interesting thing about this is when you get these outbreaks, a whole lot of things have to go wrong at the same time. The 2nd of June in Namibia is the very end of their African horse sickness season. If that shipment had been delayed by 2 or 3 weeks, probably wouldn't have had an issue. It's also the very beginning of summer in Europe. Again, if it had been a little bit earlier, you may not have had the same issue. So a lot of things had to go wrong at the same time for this outbreak to have occurred. By the 16th of July, about a month later, the first other animals started dying around that outbreak, which is the typical time frame we see from introduction of a moved animal to when outbreaks occur. And if we need to discuss that, we can discuss it in a bit more detail later. It took almost 2 months to confirm that this was African horse sickness. Obviously, diagnostic techniques were not what they are today, and that delay in confirmation possibly played a role in the further course of the outbreak. Obviously, they introduced the control measures with an infected zone, protection zone, and introduced vaccination using, it was type 4 of the virus, so they used the bottle 1 of the vaccine from South Africa in those zones. And later on, they had a monovalent vaccine, serotype 4 vaccine, which was used. That did spread to Portugal and Morocco, where there were very extensive vaccination programs during that time. And interesting enough, I happened to be in Marrakesh a few years ago, and there was a branded horse with a V on its neck, having been branded in the vaccination campaign in Morocco. What did we learn from these outbreaks in Europe? African horse sickness did overwinter in Europe. It cost a lot of money to bring it under control, and this is a good 30 years ago. It also placed the Barcelona Equestrian Games in jeopardy. And it was really interesting. African horse sickness was the first disease for which the OIE regionalized, and essentially it allowed the Barcelona Equestrian Games to actually occur. It also meant that the European Union harmonized their import conditions to include wildlife, including zebra. The import conditions that were required for the import of these zebra into Europe at that time, you would not have been able to have brought a horse in under those conditions. So they were extremely risky conditions, not very well thought through by whoever issued the permits for those animals to come in. There was no vector-protected quarantine, there was no testing, and even at that stage people knew very well that the risks associated with movement of zebra were infinitely higher than those of movement of horses. To date, it's the only episodic of African horse sickness associated with the legal, but I say, very stupid trade in equids. All right, clinical signs of African horse sickness, and now we'll have to try and see what we can do here. One of the early signs you see is swollen supraorbital foci. So this is typical in the dikkop form of African horse sickness. So the horses will probably have a temperature at this time, but the first sign that the people will see is swollen supraorbital foci. That can progress. This horse would have started with only supraorbital fossa swelling, but later on you're going to actually get exsanguination from the sclera of the eyes. Ooh, this has jumped a whole long way. Okay. All right. One of the other important things is, obviously I said it's non-infectious. This happened to be a mare with severe African horse sickness. Her foal did not get African horse sickness. There's no transmission from an infected horse to a uninfected horse naturally. Obviously, one of the things one has to be extremely careful about is it is very easy to transmit African horse sickness using needles. So if you happen to take a little bit of blood and transfer that from one horse to another, you could very easily transmit African horse sickness. So very often a horse towards the end with African horse sickness, where they've got major lung edema, so it's actually alveolar edema in the lungs, you'll see this horse is having major issues with breathing and very labored breathing. Quite a lot of horses also show signs of colic, and I think when we get to the post-mortem signs, one will see, this has actually jumped again, let me go back, sorry, these are earlier on. I'm going to have to just move this till we get the right spot. It says jumped a little bit. The other side, the acute death. Very often you'll find a horse that was 100% fine the night before. You go to the paddock in the morning, it's dead. The textbooks all show this with the foam coming out the nostrils. It is the exception, not the rule. The foam out the nostrils you do not see very often. There's obviously a post-mortem, supraorbital swelling. You'll see petechiation, hemorrhages on the sclera of the eye. I was told most people here were veterinarians could deal with gory pictures. There will be gory pictures. If you can't deal with them, now's your opportunity to get out. Also, within the vulva, in this particular case, severe petechiation within the vulva. When you skin the animal, you'll notice some sites of subcutaneous edema and hyperemia is very common. And when you cut into the particularly the muscular tissue, you find major edema intramuscular between the muscles. So basically fluid leaking into those areas. You can actually see it in the bottom there. Then when you go and open up the thorax, quite often you'll find a major hydrothorax, so fluid in the thoracic cavity. In this case, there are also some hemorrhages on the surface of the lung. There you can see probably at least half a liter of fluid in the top lung. When you're going to open the bottom, in this particular case, there must have been probably 10 liters of fluid in that lung, on that thoracic cavity. Interesting, particularly in the peracute cases, the Dinkop cases, you very often have a major hydropericard, and in this horse probably had at least a liter of fluid in the pericardial sac. With that, you also have hemorrhages, epicardial hemorrhages on the outside of the heart. And you can actually see lots of hemorrhages all over the outside of that heart. And so in the peracute cases, the Dinkop form, probably the cause of death is actually heart failure in these animals. Even fibrin clots within that pericardial fluid. If you look at the heart itself, basically the whole of the endocardium, there is massive hemorrhages. Again, in the right heart, small little ecchymosis across the whole of the endocardium. Grain on the papillary muscles, lots of hemorrhages on the papillary muscles. Massive hemorrhages in the left heart. You go and look at the lungs. You can see those lungs have septal edema. There's fluid between the septa of those lungs. And on cut surface, the fluid just oozes out of the lungs. And so in these cases, you've got alveolar edema with fluid accumulating in the alveoli, and you actually essentially get the animal drowning in its own edema fluid. If you go and have a look within the trachea, you very often see a vast amount of foam in the trachea, and sometimes that is what you see at the nostrils. Also, under that, lots of hemorrhages, subserosal hemorrhages within the trachea, throughout the larynx and pharynx. There on the surface of the spleen. And also in the gut. So you see lots of subserosal hemorrhages through quite a large portion of the gut. Also, one of the very common signs is hyperemia of the gastric part of the stomach. And if you read the reports from Spain, a number of the early cases had that. So basically, with African horse sickness, if you suddenly have horses dying inexplicably, acute death, if you see foam coming out the nostrils, on post-mortem, if you see intermuscular edema, you go and do the post-mortem, you find hydropericard, and or hydrothorax, and or gastric hyperemia. Make sure you're a veterinarian who gets remembered for contacting the right people at the beginning of an outbreak of African horse sickness, and you're not remembered as a veterinarian who missed an outbreak of African horse sickness. So we've been through the different lesions that you should see with cases of African horse sickness at post-mortem. And so basically, to summarize, the clinical signs of African horse sickness in field cases are not typical. You cannot say a pyrexic horse with supraorbital foci filling is definitely African horse sickness. At post-mortem, you will see a whole range of fairly typical lesions, and they should set alarm bells ringing for any veterinarian who knows a little bit about exotic diseases in their country. And today, laboratory testing, obviously, not only is it a legal requirement within free countries, but it is also very rapid and very specific. So if one suspects you're dealing with this, you should immediately make sure to contact the relevant authorities in your jurisdiction and get samples to an appropriate laboratory, hopefully to exclude it as the cause of the death in that animal. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think everybody now will be okay to recognize African horse sickness. Do we have some questions? Yeah, we have one here. Tu as un petit micro devant toi.
Je pose ma question en français, tu vas traduire. Quel est le temps de réponse du laboratoire pour la confirmation diagnostique?
The duration of the lab response for the diagnostic.
The question is, what is the time for laboratory response? Typically, if the samples arrive at appropriate laboratory in the morning, that laboratory should be able to give you an answer by that afternoon. So within one working day.
Hi, Simon Carpenter from Purbright. I'm thinking about the 87 outbreak, and what we've seen since then is a massive reduction in donkey populations in Europe. So do you think that might have any impact in terms of onwards transmission and persistence in Europe?
Interesting question. Obviously, you speculate what happened in Europe. The first outbreak around Madrid in 87, you never had a recurrence in that area in 88. The recurrences were way down south. My speculation is that the infection must have been moved down south in 87 and established itself in that population of midges in the Mediterranean area in 87 and was not diagnosed in 87 in the south of Spain. And then by then, you had it overwintering in the south of Spain. I think it's highly unlikely that it ever overwintered in the Madrid area and then moved in the second year. Donkey population, I don't know that part of the world very well. I do understand that there are quite a lot of feral horses down in that area. So it may have got into feral horses, it may have got into feral donkeys. Okay. Donkey numbers, obviously, in Europe, if we're talking Spanish donkeys, not African donkeys, it actually makes no difference, okay, because they're as susceptible as horses. I don't know what the African donkey numbers are in Spain or any other European country, but obviously they can be asymptomatically infected and could play a role if the populations are big enough and they live in areas where you've got almost year-round activity of midges. You could establish a reservoir in those sort of areas, as I would speculate. But again, speculation.
So to go with the question of Simon, would you think that donkeys all over the world are going to be asymptomatic? Because you were talking about African donkeys, so would it be the same everywhere?
Well, look, it's obviously the subspecies somaliensis is the one that is, I think, has lived with African horse sickness, is evolved with African horse sickness, so is not affected by it. The rest of the world, I don't know what subspecies they've got in those parts of the world. So obviously, it's a maybe question. You don't know until you see what happens in those animals.
Krista Lestelas here from the horse. I have a question about the vector. Are we talking about the same species of midge that is transmitting this virus in this illness in Africa as it was in Europe? Is it the same species?
If you go back to the European outbreak, we have our most common species in southern Africa is Culicoides amicula. That was shown to be present in the Mediterranean area in 87. But I think if you look at what's happened since then with climate change and also the experiences we've seen with other closely related viruses, so blue tongue, where you had it being transmitted by species of Culicoides which people didn't think were able to do it, and it was very effectively transmitted. So I was asked a question by a person who was veterinarian with the Hong Kong Jockey Club a few years ago, who presented a paper published out of China where they listed 157 different species of Culicoides. And the person asked me, well, which of these are vectors of African horse sickness? And my comment back to him was, well, the way I'd look at it is every single one until they're proven not to be a vector. So you don't know. And so I think it's just one of those things. If you happen to have the right virus in the right environment, it may well be transmitted by a species of Culicoides which we have had no idea that it could be transmitted by previously. So the experience of Europe with blue tongue, I think, highlights that.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Again.